Club. They're the only people. And the ones that are most interested, I find, are the Christian radio stations because they're not afraid. Health food magazines generally will not touch this story because they sell these things in their health food stores and call it health food. Now, a lot of things in the health food store are fine, but they're putting some items in there that are excitotoxins. It's a big industry, and so there's a lot of pressure to keep this story quiet. Now, let's go a little bit into the history of excitotoxicity, how all of this came about. In Japan, they used a flavoring substance for their food called kombu, or sea tangle. And this is a seaweed. When you dry it, you can grind it up, put it in your food, and it greatly enhances the taste of the food. And that's been used for 1,000 years. No one really knew why it enhanced the taste of food until 1908, when a research chemist by the name of Akita examined kombu, and he discovered that the taste-enhancing compound was glutamate. You may have heard of monosodium glutamate, of MSG. Well, that's the active compound, glutamate. So he realized that glutamate had a great potential to enhance the taste of foods. So he made a friendship with the Suzuki Spice Company owner, Suzuki, and together they formed another company called Ajinomoto. The Ajinomoto, which means essence of taste, this company began to manufacture monosodium glutamate, or MSG. By 1933, they were producing about 10 million pounds of MSG and putting it in the food. Now, MSG is a much higher concentration of glutamate than in kombu. So they were suddenly flooding their society with very high concentrations of monosodium glutamate. During World War II, or right after World War II, when we had some of the rations from the Japanese soldiers, they realized that their rations tasted far better than our rations. And so the Quartermaster Corps looked into it and found out, well, the reason it tasted so much better was because of MSG. And they called a conference in 1948 and invited all the major food manufacturers, Libby and Continental and General Mills and Borden, Campbell's, were all invited to this conference. And the quartermasters told them, we have discovered an incredible taste-enhancing compound called monosodium glutamate, or MSG. Well, the major food manufacturers had problems with packaging their foods. They found out, well, we cooked it, after it sits a while or it's in the can, it loses some of its taste. It develops some of the tin-type taste from out of the can, so it has this tinny-type taste. And so this would be an answer. And they found out it would remove all those bad tastes. It would restore and even magnify the taste of the food, so it's just scrumptious. If you put MSG in a soup, it's the most delicious soup you'll ever eat because it enhances the taste by stimulating certain cells in the brain and the tongue. So from 1948 to 1956, these food processors were adding tremendous amounts of this monosodium glutamate to our foods. And they assumed it was safe because an amino acid, one of the breakdown products of a protein, so they said, well, it's a nutrient, it must be safe, but no one tested it. So from 1948 to 1957, it was being added even to baby foods, because the baby food manufacturer said, oh, let's get the babies to eat, so we'll put it in the baby food. Well, then in 1957, two ophthalmology residents did a research project. And they were studying a rare eye disease in immature mice, and so, in humans, so they would use some immature mice, and they fed them monosodium glutamate. This is the only picture I could find of an ophthalmologist, so. I hope there's no ophthalmologist I'm offending them. So in 1957, Lucas and Newhouse, two ophthalmologists, they did this experiment, and what they found to their surprise was that the monosodium glutamate totally destroyed all the nerve cells in the retina of the eye. Just wiped them out. And so they wrote up their project, put it in a journal, but it was a rather obscure ophthalmology journal, so hardly anyone read it. And so it sat there for another 10 years until 1968, a neuroscientist came across it while he was doing a project, and he said, well, this would be a good way for me to study the anatomy of the different nerve pathways that go from the eye through the brain. I'll just use this monosodium glutamate to kill the eye cells, and then I can trace it back through the brain. Well, he did that, and what he found out to his surprise was that it not only destroyed the eye cells, but it was destroying critical parts of the brain as well. And that the parts of the brain that was being destroyed resemble some destruction we see in things like strokes, things we see with severe hypoglycemia or very low blood sugars, and like we see in diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And so he immediately realized this is something that's quite serious because this is a food ingredient. And he thought, he told me this story. He said, naively, I thought all I had to do is present the information to food manufacturers and they would take it out. And he said, to my surprise, they just totally ignored it. They said, we don't care. It doesn't make any difference. By then, it was a multi-billion-dollar business. And it solved their food taste problems. So he went to his congressman, and congressman called a congressional hearing, and he presented it before a congressional hearing. Overwhelming. He was a neuropathologist as well as a neuroscientist. He presented his evidence, showed these severe lesions produced in the brain by monosodium glutamate. The food industry was present at the hearing, particularly those who make baby foods. And they saw the handwriting on the wall. If this reaches the public, we're in deep trouble. So they said, well, we voluntarily will remove monosodium glutamate from baby foods because that's a very sensitive time when the brain is forming. So they voluntarily withdrew MSG. Well, not really. For 10 more years, they continued to add it, but in a disguised name. And the amount they were adding to the baby food was the amount that was being used to destroy these brain cells in these animals. Even today, they add excitotoxins to baby foods, and they created a new class of food called toddler foods to sidestep this restriction they put on themselves. And in toddler foods, if you look at it, you'll see several of these excitotoxins have been added. And it's also added to baby formulas. Now, let's look at what I call the big lies of the industry. When all of this starts leaking out, and it was starting to leak out about the dangers of MSG, the industry's reaction was, well, we had our scientists look at it, and we don't see any problem. Their first solution was, well, the doses used in those experiments were very high doses, and that's not what you're going to see babies eating and children and women. That's not a reason. We're using little tiny doses. That was lie number one. Lie number two was they said, well, even if it does enter the bloodstream and in very high concentrations, the brain has a protective system called the blood-brain barrier that keeps certain toxins from your blood from entering your brain. And it would keep that glutamate out of your brain and wouldn't damage it. And when that didn't work, they went to the third lie. They had a research paper that said, well, we have studied it and found out that if you eat a lot of carbohydrates and sugar, it inhibits this toxicity and doesn't occur, so that protects you. And most people eat meals that have carbohydrates in it, so it's really no problem. Well, let's look at lie number one. Lie number one, saying that these little small quantities. But what we'll see later on is that humans are more sensitive to the toxicity of MSG than any experimental animal. We're 5 times more sensitive than the next most sensitive life form, the mouse. 5 times more sensitive. We're 20 times more sensitive than a rhesus monkey. This is a study that was done by the FASEP organization. That's the Federation of American Societies of Experimental Biology. They did a review of all the things that had been written about MSG. And they were going to have a final conclusion about the safety of MSG. The study was conducted and paid for by the FDA, and it had an executive summary in the front part of it that if you read it, you would think they never saw the actual